Hey everyone, welcome back to CryptoCache. Thank you again so much for joining me here. Hope you're having a fantastic day. Let's take a look here at Solana, see what's going on. Double checking a few key factors. We're basically at open from yesterday, or no, yesterday's close. However, we're breaking even for the day. This is actually a good sign because most altcoins are struggling today, and it seems like Solana is finding its tentative bottom. Keep in mind, if Bitcoin continues lower, which is expected, we'll probably see a bit of a pullback here. But once more, we got some solid support levels here, specifically this level here at about 130, 130.50. We talked about that previously being a strong resistance, retest as a support. We now have a potential double bottom. I mean, really not a double bottom, but either way you look at it, we were retesting this level a second time, okay? And that's the important thing to recognize, that this is a good support. However, Bitcoin continues further back. We're going to look at some DCA targets and some important levels for Solana to see what might happen next if it does. Key takeaway here is we've broken our ascending trend line. We didn't get that bullish backtest, that 135.50 range, which was supposed to have worked as a support. So now we're seeing a pullback, and it makes sense. So the question now is, do we short or do we take a long here? Okay, so we'll talk about what option might be more feasible or realistic. And when we look at these things here, folks, we're only looking at statistical probabilities for the most part, right? There's not a lot of things like outside of the technical charts that we can see that we know exactly what's going to happen. Like Fed rate meeting here this week, that's gonna change some things. Okay, so keep in mind there's a lot of different iterations of what could happen. That can all change, but for the most part, we're looking for statistical probabilities here of either upside or downside. Really, that's all it is. We're just kind of building a case in either direction. So that's kind of where we're at. And I try to make these videos as simple to understand as possible, put things in, not to say layman's terms, but hope you understand why things are the way they are. So I hope you can learn something today. If you learned something, comment below. More important, just hit the like button on every video. It really helps get this in front of more people so those moon boys stop getting the views, right? Because again, I'm just going to shoot you straight. There's no moon in my world. Correction. There is a real moon in my world, just not in the crypto world. I think that it's important to distinguish the two. So let's take a look here. We got some liquidation levels to the downside, 127 as a local low. So in the last 7 days, we've seen no more liquidation below the 127 range. We have some previous liquidation levels from roughly 2 to 3 weeks ago at about 125. So me personally, 125 is probably a worst case scenario for Solana. If I recall correctly, 125 is close to that little range here, basically the golden pocket and this lower support level. Okay, so again, generally speaking, positive stuff overall. Having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at the daily, see what's going on. In fact, why don't we just go ahead and jump into the weekly too and kind of quickly understand some things here. I'm going to remove this here. We can draw that out later and just get perspective on the overall sentiment. And again, this is looking very similar to Bitcoin. Look at Bitcoin's chart. We got this similar pattern here where the 20-day SMA is above the price and the 50 is below. Generally speaking, the 50-day SMA is going to work as a support range. Okay, now it's not like this exact thing where the price wicks down and touches it. You'll see that happen sometimes, but it's not one of those things that's like you don't want to put a ton of value into this one thing. However, multiple SMAs adding up over multiple time frames, that's important. Important also to recognize not to use too many time frames. I know there's some people that they'll show like these other influencers. They're using like 30 different time frames. They're literally just sitting there trying to convince themselves that it's a good trade, right? You should be convincing yourself it's not a good trade, and you want to use specific time frames that are kind of weighted in their period. In other words, the weekly gives you a good perspective on what happened last week. The daily, last 24 hours, 4 hour, and so on and so forth, right? Anyways, I would say it's probably best to use no more than 4 or 5 indicators, or time frames rather, and spread your indicators across them. Okay. Anyways, I just like to kind of mention that because some folks get super like sold on like an astronomical amount of indicators, and like they only use Elliott wave. I just think that's very unilateral. You want to use more than one thing, diversify, but don't overcomplicate it. All right. All that being said, under 50 on the RSI here, that's right where Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is kind of wavering above and below for a little while. So the truth is, this is not a phenomenal situation for Solana. We've lost momentum. The weekly looks like it could continue lower. However, you got to recognize we do have a pretty strong support range of this 120, as well as this volume profile here in the 100 to about 105, 110 range. While we don't have a ton of volume in the current price point of like 115 to 125, it's important to recognize that we have a solid shelf there. And if we lose that, then we might see a run towards the 110 or lower, but we got to give this support range a chance to hold. Okay, so again, that's just the macro. So simply put, the weekly doesn't look phenomenal, but it doesn't necessarily imply the price is just going to drop right now. It implies the overall sentiment, maybe in the next couple of weeks, we could see a lower price point for Solana. Look at the daily though, because again, What happens on the daily? 7 days equals 1 week, right? So what do we look at here on the daily? We want to recognize that there is a stochastic divergence. We've seen this for a little while. Bitcoin has the same thing. We're under 50 on the RSI, didn't break bullish, and our money flow index, albeit still pretty good, is coming down. We're over 50, over 0, basically this is this 0 line here for TSI. Generally a good sign, shows we have good momentum, and until we break below that, I'm not super convinced that we're in the doghouse completely yet. But we do look at the SMAs once more. This is on the daily time frame. We're now under the 20-day SMA, and that's generally construed as a bearish sign, or just more importantly, somewhat of a shift of momentum. Okay. So again, you don't put all your money in one bag because of that, but you do want to consider that this is an important factor. However, how Solana is behaving compared to or contrary to the rest of the market is important, specifically Bitcoin. So if we look at its trend, we see we're establishing lower highs and lower lows. Obviously, same thing for Bitcoin. We see this here though. This nice little bounce here was not present for Bitcoin in the recent drop. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily imply that it's going to hold. It just tells us that we got a lot of support here, and it's going to take more volume to get below that price action, or more selling pressure from Bitcoin to do that. My expectation is that Bitcoin is going to bounce off this area about 57.5, try to retest the upper mid to low 58K range, and then drop again. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a dead cat, but we have a previous resistance at 58.4. I think that'll work strong, and that should allow Solana to essentially recover a little bit and then potentially pull back. So we might see a fair value gap fill here upwards 135. So if you're going to take a long position, I would just recommend securing profits in kind of a tighter margins. Because again, the overall sense here is that we are making lower lows and Bitcoin's due to correct itself further. But it may also be at its bottom too. There's a lot of confluence at 57,000. So me personally, I'm just looking for a short opportunity in the mid 58K range for Bitcoin. That may translate to a short here for Solana, but if you know me by now, you'll recognize that I don't like shorting Solana, even if it has a lot of confirming factors, which we're under 50 on the RSI, money flow index is low, stochastic swinging up. A lot of signs here pointing down. Keep in mind, however, this is a good sign, generally something we like to see here. When the RSI gets closer to 30 and the money flow gets closer to 20, it's commonly a bouncing point or a pivot point for most coins. While it's never a substantial launch to the moon, as they say, or back up to the 140 range, I think we will probably see a reattempt to the local high, this 135.50. Remember, that was the previous support, turned resistance, turned support. It doesn't know what the hell it's doing, but it's a consistency in the trading. Okay. Having said that, all this stuff combined, we look at this here, we have significant bottoming out here. So there's a solid chance we could and should see a bounce here soon. Okay, what we're looking for is some type of doji candle that looks like this here, overextended and closing above its open. That's essentially what you're looking at. So take a look here at the hourly. Let's quickly recognize just the overall sentiment, still the same as before. The lagging span getting closer to the price action is telling us that we're starting to find our bottom. You could argue, though, that this is just, somewhat of a bear flag, which does actually look like one. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see further downside here, honestly. Same thing with, Bitcoin, too. It's performing similarly. But if Bitcoin does end up pulling back, we will see Solana rake down to the 125 to 127 range. I'm going to set an alert at in this golden pocket area, roughly 127.50. And I'm going to reevaluate and see if it's worth either A, taking a long there, or if we've invalidated, we consider it maybe a short. I don't think a short would be appropriate in that range because there's a lot of support there. But once more, stranger things can happen, right? So at this point, depending on how Bitcoin performs, also, we got our Fed meeting this week too. A lot of contributing factors to the price being kind of wonky and weird. So I would not expect amazing things this week. This is a kind of a trashy week. I don't love trading these kind of weeks here. If I do, I usually might, I'll just have I'll have one long position open going into it, and then I may open a short position as a hedge, right? You never truly know, but the key takeaway here is to not over leverage or overuse your position size. Don't go too high. I always recommend no more than 5% of your overall portfolio, and I also recommend too diversifying your portfolios, basically a swing trade and a day trade portfolio, right? Now we use Bitunix, as you've probably already known, for quite some time. They've been awesome with us, but we also have this option here too through BTCC. I'd recommend using them, link down below. It's like a good secondary option for you. Consider utilizing them as perhaps a day trading or swing trading portfolio, because the separation of those two is extremely important. But generally speaking, based on overextension here, I think this is a solid place to consider a long. Just make sure you recognize that it is higher risk. but the reward ratio could be solid if you make sure that you are using tighter margins, right? Secure some profit before 135, you're going to take a long. That being said, Bitcoin is probably more likely to pull back. And if that happens, then we could see this flag pattern pay out here and Solana comes lower. I think a better consideration for long is the 126 to 127 range, mainly because we have some liquidation down there. Once that gets swept, then I think we're going to be all set and good to go. So I'm looking for an entry in the 127, 128, possibly 125 as a secondary. All right, I'll post our playout chart on Twitter, Telegram, and Discord here soon, just so you understand where that's at. It looks a little something like this. Don't trust anybody else that's trying to pose as me. FYI, on Discord, we have this this section here, this report scam section. Please make sure you read through it. There's a lot of imposters, unfortunately. I guess, you know, imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, right? That's what they say. But it just upsets the heck out of me that these scammers are trying to take money from good people. So never trust that. I'll never DM you first. All right, folks, thanks again for your time. We'll see you in the next one. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.